This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
If you're a seeker, don't miss the inspiring book Shamanic Awakening, Between the Dark and the Daylight. This remarkable work chronicles shamanic counselor and indigenously trained dream decoder Sandra Cochran's 35 years of experience with diverse wisdom keepers throughout the Americas. Sandy's initiations across the British Isles, Turkey, Greece, and Egypt, combined with her knowledge of symbology, psychology, and myth, influence her dream blog and workshops. Sandy offers private readings, sacred international journeys, a meditative CD, and her book, Shamanic Awakening, to encourage you as you navigate your earth walk and create a deeper connection to yourself. Find this and more at her website, starwalkervisions.com.
The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Gwilda Wiyaka's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the Science of Magic or endorsed in any manner by Gwilda Wiyaka, Relmar McConnell Media Company, its affiliated networks, stations, or employees. Welcome to the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, a program dedicated to uncovering the unified nature of reality and humanity's ever-evolving place as truly galactic beings. For more information on the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit us online at www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Welcome to the Science of Magic, a place where science and magic come together to transform fact into evolving truth. We're proudly coming to you through the ever-expanding X-Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net, and can also be found on our website, thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. This hour we'll be exploring a third option. If we become introspective enough, we can detect the themes running through our lives. One of mine is being placed in the middle of polarization and opposing viewpoints. I didn't grow up in one family, but in many. At age 5, weekends were spent with my grandparents, who were devout Christians. During the week, I lived with my father and stepmother, devout atheists. Both factions bludgeoned me with their viewpoint and openly condemned the other. Loving both, this caused great conflict in my young heart, a conflict I've spent the rest of my life trying to resolve. Even as a child, I could tell both viewpoints were short-sighted and incomplete. In contrast, I would sit outside under an ancient cottonwood tree on my father's farm and listen to the meadowlarks sing. It was there I came to know spirit. It was there I recognized truth. All aspects of life work together in perfect non-polarized synchronicity. Nature is all-inclusive, judging against nothing. Observing natural law brought an awareness of my place as an integral part of the circle of life. The tree didn't demand I agree with its viewpoint in order to lean up against its trunk, and the meadowlark shared its song, regardless of my species or gender. As I grew older, I lived with many families overseas, where I was exposed to cultural and political polarization. Standing in the middle and contemplating opposing viewpoints revealed partial truth and limitations in disparate political and cultural beliefs. A kernel of truth with giant leaps of illogic and agreed-upon dogma. In college, I studied science and religion, both of which were polarized and mutually exclusive. The antagonism is currently evident in the New Age movement versus the materialistic scientific approach. While New Age seekers tend to look for spirit and ancient practices, they often don't follow the forms to their roots. Instead, they might incorporate a little from here, a little from there, expecting magic to take care of the rest. On the other hand, science pursues fact through scientific studies, distorted by the observer effect and reliance upon instrumentation too coarse to register spiritual frequencies. The process results in erroneous or incomplete conclusions. The current human systems all share one basic flaw. They've been designed around polarization and opposing viewpoints. At this time in history, we're moving into a portion of the galaxy that supports non-duality and unification. Pressure is being brought to bear on polarized systems. These archaic structures are crumbling, leaving us with seemingly no guidance and no place to turn. I've always had a deep sense that something much greater than any of us flows through and unites all things. I couldn't understand why those around me looked for spirit in or facts in differences and disagreement rather than in similarities and alignment. When did humans step out of the flow of life, and why? When the human world makes no sense, which is often, I return to nature where all is one. The natural world has become the litmus test, one that never fails me. Any time I'm presented with a viewpoint or set of beliefs, I compare it to the way life works. If the proposed reality doesn't line up with the spirit of nature, I know it's intrinsically flawed. Our guest this hour, Steve McIntosh, is a leader in the integral philosophy movement and an author of the books The Presence of the Infinite, Evolution's Purpose, and Integral Consciousness. In addition to his work in spiritual philosophy, Steve is also a co-founder and president of the integral political think tank, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, which focuses on the cultural roots of America's challenges. Prior to his involvement with the integral movement, he had a variety of other successful careers, including founding the consumer products company Now and Zen. After this commercial break, I'll introduce Steve, and together we'll examine spirituality, non-duality, evolutionary consciousness, and spiritual leadership. It should be transformative, so don't go away. You're listening to The Science of Magic. Prior innovative episodes can always be found on our website, thescienceofmagic.net.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
How would you like to be able to read other people's minds? Well, the next best thing is here. When you know how to read a person's name, you know how the person thinks, feels, and behaves. Each letter in our name holds a key to unlock our true essence. Our name contains both our gifts and challenges in this lifetime. Mnemology science discovers personality secrets hidden in the placement of the letters of our names, including the first and last impression people remember about us. Sharon shows us how to interpret the arrangement of letters as outlined in her book, Know the Name, Know the Person. Sharon Lynn Wyeth created mnemology science after 18 years of research and testing her theories, and has supported thousands of people around the world in understanding themselves and others better. You'll enjoy Sharon's unique teachings as she shares her system to learn the gifts behind your given birth name. Even if you don't like your birth name, there are jewels in this book. If you're thinking of changing your name, ready to name your child, or wanting to get along better with others, this is the book for you. If you'd like to improve your relationships and change your life for the better, get the book today, Know the Name, Know the Person, or visit www.knowthename.com. That's www.knowthename.com.
Take a step back in time and discover old Florida cuisine at Marsh Landing Restaurant in Fellsmere, Florida. Enjoy delicacies such as frog legs, gator tail, catfish, and swamp cabbage, or enjoy the more traditional cuisine such as hand-cut Angus steaks, ribs, and seafood. Join us for breakfast with a southern flair featuring sweet potato pancakes, biscuits and gravy, and much more. Planning a party? Marsh Landing's private dining rooms can accommodate groups from 8 to 80 people. While you visit, enjoy the historic pictures, artifacts, and stories that line the walls. Marsh Landing is truly a unique experience. Marsh Landing Restaurant, 44 North Broadway in historic downtown Fellsmere, or visit marshlandingrestaurant.com. Marsh Landing, old Florida cuisine at its best.
Welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour, Steve McIntosh, is a leader in the integral philosophy movement and the author of the books, The Presence of the Infinite, Evolution's Purpose, and Integral Consciousness. His website is stevemcintosh.com. Steve, thank you so much for joining us on The Science of Magic.
Hi, Gwilda. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah. I understand you have a background in law. What drew you to work with spiritual philosophy?
Well, I was much into spirituality, alternative progressive spirituality, in the 70s, and I had really identified myself as what we might think of today as a New Ager. But towards the end of the 70s, I realized that I wanted to have the creative advantages of being part of the mainstream culture. Not that I was going to completely co-opt myself, but I went to business school and then to law school in order to get the establishment credentials I needed to create things and to be, financially independent, even while I was, a spy for the New Age the whole time. But so it wasn't as if I started out thinking like a lawyer and then became a spiritual person. I was a spiritual person and I wanted to study law. And, I worked that career out and got a lot out of it. But I didn't practice law for too many years.
Mm. I find it increasingly amazing how extreme polarization seems to have worked its way into every aspect of human life. It's almost like a madness. Would you speak to this?
Sure. Well, polarity is a condition of the universe. In other words, we could look at the sort of the master polarity as infinite and finite, or being and becoming, or absolute and relative. As long as we're here in the finite universe of becoming, the pattern of becoming is polarity, right? Something new emerges, something more comes from something less, and that creates a kind of polarity. So the polarities that we see in life, both the positive polarities like male-female or freedom and order, or the positive negative polarities like poverty and prosperity, right? These polarities are largely created by the conditions of becoming in the universe, and we can either work with polarities to maximize their generative potential, their procreative potential, like male and female, or we can fall into a variety of fallacies that attend to the management of polarities, like, for instance, clinging always to one pole and never the other, one pole good, the other pole bad, or simply trying to always meet in the middle, kind of a compromise fallacy of trying to split the difference between every polarity. But when we understand that polarities are a condition of being and becoming, we find that there's actually a practice of working with them that keeps us from falling into extremes and getting stuck.
We know it's moving a positive and negative around a neutral pole is the basis behind generating electricity and all other kind of energy. So the key here is movement. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't simplify it to say just that the key is movement. I would say that understanding polarities involves being able to tell the difference between a permanent polarity to be managed that continuously recurs and that is sort of indestructible, continues to come up, and understanding some kinds of polarities are problems to be solved. So, for instance, prosperity and poverty is a problem to be solved. I think that even though there's a polarity there, and there will be for as long as we're alive, I think that eventually we can bring prosperity to just about everybody in the world. So that's even though it's a polarity, it's a polarity that we can work with and actually get beyond. But other kinds of polarities like freedom and order, or even competition and cooperation, these continue to recur. And we're dealing with an interdependent positive polarity. Part of the way of understanding it is that not only is polarity the condition of the universe, but it's also inherent in almost every situation where value is being created. In other words, values themselves and things that create value cohere in polar sets. And so when you have a polarity that's positive, and interdependent, if you go too far to one on one pole to the exclusion of the other, pathology results. Ideally, the two poles rule each other. So a good example would be in a work environment, right? People who are managing other people have to work with a polarity of challenge and support, right? In other words, if it's too much challenge, if you're on somebody's case all day long, then the work environment becomes toxic, right? And morale is sapped. But in a work environment, if it's all support, people in a sense become spoiled or lazy. At least some do. Some work better in an environment of support. Others work better in an environment of challenge. But overall, these two positive ways of working with people, they're interdependent in the sense that one ideally works with the other to maximize its relative value creation, if I can get that across.
So when does polarity become non-productive?
Well, polarity becomes non-productive when people approach it in a binary way, when they're dealing with a permanent positive polarity, but they see it not as a system to be managed, but as a problem to be solved. So, for example, if in a political situation, the people who occupy the other side of the political pole from you are always wrong or always idiots or, need to be crushed at all costs, then you find yourself clinging to one side of a polarity without recognizing the need for integration and interdependence.
How much does that stance that you just described have to do with projection of our things that we're in denial of onto the other party?
Well, certainly that comes into it. I mean, if we were to analyze the psychology of, pathological polarity management, if you will, then we could identify many contributing factors that cause projection or make people afraid or make them think in binary black and white terms. Part of it has to do with their worldview, the frame of values that they have. And whether that value frame is inclusive of other values or whether it is more defensive in the protection of its own values against those that it sees as opponents or enemies.
We often talk about how with the internet and everything, the world is shrinking. Do you think this is having an effect on the worldview? What effect do you think this is having on the tendency to polarize in a negative way?
Well, certainly the media silos that are created by social media, for example, the echo chambers, the media is undergoing definitely a huge transition, as is obvious and even cliche to talk about. But even as it becomes, there are forces of decay which make the media less truthful, which make it more polarized, more siloed. There's a real upside to that, and that is the media is increasingly democratized. So it used to be that there, at least in America, there are 3 networks, and they controlled the news, and they had a kind of a middle consensus of the American opinion, and other viewpoints on the tail ends of the spectrum were definitely frozen out within the media that people could consume. Now, not only do we have negative fringe views readily available and in a media space, but we also have transformative views that were seen by the mainstream as being fringe and were excluded just like the negative fringe. But the democratization of the media is the upside to the downside of the the tribalism, that's being created by the lack of a coherent authority that we can look to in the media.
So there's a certain amount of irresponsibility in the media at this point, as far as what's going out there and how it's negative and how it creates the difficult type of polarization where people get locked down. And at the same time, you're saying that there's a positive side to that?
Well, sure. That is, part of the reason that American culture, American political culture, is so divided and split is that it's somewhat as a result of two different moral systems pulling on the body politic, pulling on the electorate. They're competing. The traditional moral system and the progressive moral system are both, in a sense, seeking to be the authority for values in the culture. And some people are pulled toward the more traditional set of values. Other people are pulled toward the more progressive set of values. It's not a simple binary. I mean, it's a complex picture that may be a little bit too complex to unpack in this context. But part of the reason that we're polarized is that this is a result of growth, right? The emergence of new kinds of culture have disrupted the old center. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the way evolution works, not just biological evolution, but also cultural evolution, is that first there's differentiation, and that leads to, or at least makes possible, a higher level of integration. So our culture's differentiating from a more monolithic cultural consensus into one that's, currently constituted by severe polarization, and there's two ways that might turn out. One way is it might result in a regression, right? In other words, we might regress back to an earlier time when there was less polarity. I don't think that's going to be the case. But the upside, the positive potential for this challenging situation of a divided national body is for there to appear a new level, an integrative level, right? This evolutionary pattern was first recognized by the idealist philosophers 200 years ago. Hegel, right? Many people are familiar with him. His idea of the dialectical progression, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So over the last 70 years or more, depending on how you divide it up, there's been a new antithesis to the mainstream, right? A new counterculture that's emerged since the 60s and is consolidated into a significant cultural bloc. And that stands, in some ways in contempt of modernity and questions many of the pathologies that have arisen around, the modernization of the developed world. And so there are many valid criticisms that have been brought up in many ways that modernity fails at being, adequate to humanity's ideals. And this antithesis has caused a disruption for good and for bad. But it calls forth, it's pointing to the potential of a higher level synthesis, right? So if I could just add one more thing about that philosophically, Hegel rarely, if only once, described this process of emergence and development. He didn't describe it as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He described it as affirmation, negation, and then negation of the negation. And what that means is that the progressive, postmodern, countercultural, cultural creative culture, which I've been part of for many years, like I said at the beginning, has defined my identity since the 70s. That, in a sense, has many ways that it's made its evolutionary advance by rejecting materialism, scientism, consumerism, environmental degradation, all the things that it can point to about modernity, which it sees as pathological. So that's a kind of a negation of modernity's thesis. Now, the synthesis, this integral or evolutionary perspective that's emerging beyond the progressive worldview, including it, but also attempting to transcend it, that it makes its advance, in a sense, by negating at least part of the original negation. In other words, we're saying, okay, modernity is pathological in many ways, but we also see that we're standing on its shoulders.
We're going to have to take a quick commercial break, and we'll pick up with this on the other side. Steve and I will return to our discussion on the flip side. We're coming to you through the X-Zone Broadcast Network. Don't miss the other fine shows and hosts on xzbn.net. You're listening to The Science of Magic, thescienceofmagic.net. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka. There's more practical spirituality to come, so don't you go away.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
While science pursues fact, magic accesses the quantum level, bridging random facts to form truth. As long as science and magic remain separate and polarized, the truth cannot be known. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka. Join me on the Science of Magic radio program, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. During each episode, I'll be speaking with experienced and respected scientists and mystics. From astrologers to astronomers, from medical doctors to shaman, the scientific method to dowsing and intuition, we'll weave together information from seemingly divergent practices to promote unity and enlightenment. Join me, Gwilda Wiyaka, and the Science of Magic right here on the Mutual Broadcast Network. For more information, visit www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Gibbs A. Williams, Ph.D., is a practicing psychoanalyst, supervisor, researcher, and author in New York City. Much of his life has been dedicated to understanding nature and the uses of meaningful coincidences or synchronicities. His radical and original non-Jungian, non-mystical, non-magical theory of synchronicities illuminates much of the fog surrounding this challenging and perplexing topic. His ideas and manners are fresh, presented in a style that is both entertaining and highly informative. He is also an expert on crisis intervention, specially focused on violence reduction for the police and citizens, mastering anxiety, frustration, and stress without the use of medication, and effectively preventing and treating heroin addiction. Dr. Williams can be contacted at his email address at gwwilliamsny11@aol.com or visit his website at Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
True healing must address 4 levels: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, for us to live joyful and productive lives. We tend to treat 3 of the 4, leaving the spiritual languishing. If you're tired of the same dysfunctional patterns cropping up in your life, Soul Balancing is for you. Trixie Phelps, owner and founder of Soul Balancing, is a naturally gifted energy healer trained in numerous esoteric forms, including shamanism. Trixie has created a powerful modality that safely and effectively clears your energetic field. A soul balancing session can remove interference, heal trauma, and restore your hope. Contact Trixie for a life-changing long-distance session today, www.soulbalancing.world. Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Steve McIntosh, the author of The Presence of the Infinite, Evolution's Purpose, and Integral Consciousness. Stephen, as you were talking, it strikes me that we're really kind of in volatile times, aren't we?
Well, indeed. They're volatile in the sense that things are emerging quickly. and the rapidity of that emergence is in some ways destabilizing, right? So we see the phenomenon of Trump in the United States. Part of that is can be explained as a reaction against many of the rapid progressive cultural changes that have occurred over the last few years. And while that doesn't excuse it or reduce, at least from my perspective, the horror of it, there's a ways in which we can contextualize it in history and in the evolution of consciousness and culture that helps us appreciate that it's not necessarily the decline and fall of Western civilization, that there's a certain amount of adjustment. I mean, we go forward and we have to go back a little bit and reconsolidate, and that allows us to go further forward. So I'm definitely optimistic despite the turmoil that we're in at the moment.
Well, process is ugly, isn't it? Why do you think we're evolving at this time?
Well, I think that evolution is our condition, indeed our purpose in the universe is to evolve, to participate in the becoming, not just as spectators or people going along for the ride, but as participants, as agents of evolution, right? And when I talk about evolution, I'm talking about the universe's ceaseless process of becoming, right, which occurs in cosmology, in biology, and also continuing in a new phase in consciousness and culture. And this evolution of consciousness and culture that we're participating in it's been occurring all along, but we're in a kind of a cultural Cambrian explosion, if you will, at least for the last 300 years, in that evolution has been speeding up. But the way evolution works
Can I ask you?
Yes, jump in.
Yeah. Why is it speeding up? What's causing that?
Well, part of it is connectivity, right? In other words, we now have this amazing global communication system. So even as the world is bigger than it's ever been, 7 billion people or whatever it is by now, it's also smaller than it's ever been because we're more connected, right? What happens on the other side of the world can affect us directly in ways that we were insulated from before. And so that connectivity has sped things up tremendously. Also, humans have been empowered physically by the wealth, the great enrichment. It used to be that the vast majority of the world lived on the equivalent of $2 a day. And while way too many people still are locked in grinding poverty at $2 a day or whatever, we now have a giant portion of the world who now makes thousands of times more than that, even if they're not wealthy, even if they're just participants in the normal, mainstream economy of the developed world. If we measure enrichment in terms of power, in terms of the ability to communicate on this democratized media, right, the ability to travel, the ability to gain the world's knowledge with a click, this is a significant empowerment of humanity, both materially and by way of knowledge. And,
so if we're not tied up and hand to mouth, that gives us more time to get into trouble, or to contemplate.
That's one way to see it. Certainly, more power and more opportunity creates more opportunity for trouble, but it also creates more opportunity for positive growth.
Right, exactly. So we have more time to contemplate higher things, right?
Absolutely, right. In other words, many of the achievements of postmodern culture, right, the prioritization of the environment, as a cultural value, the environment, for example, that it's fundamental, but it's also a luxury in the sense that people who live in third world countries, for example, they may care about the environment, but feeding their children is a much higher priority. And if that involves, deforesting a hillside to keep warm, then they've got to do that. We don't have to do that. So we have the luxury of caring about the environment. It's an achievement that's standing on the shoulders of the previous achievements of the great enrichment. So it's important to appreciate how these stages of development in consciousness and culture are interdependent. Just like I was about to say, all levels of evolution, the way evolution works is it builds on what came before. It doesn't just transcend, it also includes, right? So, our bodies are made up of cells. Cells are made up of molecules. There's this natural holarchy, as it's known in integral parlance. And that same holarchy can be recognized in culture, where we're depending upon the achievements of earlier levels. So that's one of the programs of integral consciousness or integral philosophy, is to try to reintegrate the best of what came before while skillfully pruning away the pathologies that are attendant upon those earlier stages of development.
So basically what we're seeing in this integral consciousness is what we see in all life. when we're going to evolve, we have to break things down to their constituent parts and rearrange them into the new form. And that's that process's ugly piece. Is this what you're talking about?
Well, not exactly. I would say that because we're trying to go beyond what's wrong. All of us have a sense, most humans at least, have a sense of our opportunity to contribute to making the world a better place. To making ourselves more evolved, to making our culture more evolved, to helping people who are in need, to solving many of the problems that confront us in this world of trouble and suffering. So our instinct to try to make things better begins by noticing what's wrong, by rejecting the pathology of the existing conditions. And so that makes people restless. It makes people combative, right? They're trying to condemn what's wrong. And so it can take the form of a positive grasping for higher values, higher, more inclusive cultural agreement structures, or it can involve tearing down the problems of what's wrong that came before. And I think there are healthy and negative versions of both of those processes, but they exist together. We've got to get rid of what's wrong, and we've got to build on what's right.
So we, living in these volatile times, and I can't help but, I talk to a lot of people, and I can't help but notice a lot of people are just kind of lost. They're just kind of floundering because everything's changing so rapidly, and they're losing their way. What kind of leadership do you think society will require to support us through this transition?
Well, I think that leadership is a complex subject involving many variables, of course. At some level, leadership means giving people something positive to do. Helping people achieve their self-actualizing needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Leadership involves fulfilling all of those needs, but the higher levels of need, the need for people to self-actualize themselves, that depends on their service to the world. In other words, your own self-actualization is tied up with your ability to create value, right? To make the conditions better in some small or even large way. So as people seek leadership, they seek guidance, they seek inspiration, they seek a kind of spiritual energy that helps them participate in not only their own self-actualization, but the self-actualization of the larger culture. So leadership, the spiritual energy of leadership, if you will, when it's done right, involves, in a sense, the communication or transmittal of intrinsic value, like the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so when we want to get to the essence of leadership, we can see it in those who are exemplars of the good, the true, and the beautiful.
So that kind of leads into my next question. It's like, what makes the difference between someone that's seeking the leadership and a leader?
Well, everyone who would lead, right, must work on that. I mean, ideally, you're leading in your being, and such that you don't have to go out to the world and promote yourself, right? You do what you're doing, and people notice because it's creating value. That's the most authentic kind of leadership. But we live in a world where ideal types are not always realized. Every, I think, leader that we can point to who we might admire and say that person's demonstrating excellent leadership, they had to work it a bit. They had to put their work out in the world in a way that people could appreciate it and value it. So there's both the instrumental and the intrinsic, right? Ways in which things are just good as they are and they attract people, and ways in which we do have a duty to communicate, to promote, to go out in the world. Like you've got this excellent radio series and a certain amount of sharing that with the world and letting people know that it's out there and that they would benefit from listening. That's part of the process of your leadership that you're offering with the Science of Magic.
So, materialistic science is admittedly short-sighted right now when it comes to spiritual issues. But on the other hand, some New Age practices are really subject to kind of ungrounded, magical thinking. Would you mind going into this a little bit?
Well, sure. Part of the perspective of this integral philosophy or integral consciousness that I represent or I'm part of recognizes that there's a pattern of development in human consciousness and culture. and that there are many patterns. It's a complex structure of development. But there is no development that lacks a structure, and understanding the patterns of development in human culture and consciousness helps us appreciate how we can make things, how we can participate in co-creating further evolution, making things better by making them more inclusive and more whole. So every one of these stages has both a beautiful expression of itself and a fundamentalism, right? A kind of a rigid clinging. And so, for example, within traditional religious culture, there are these beautiful expressions of service and love, right, that we find in pretty much every traditional religion. But there are also people who ascribe to a kind of a fundamentalist, rigid version of that, right? Not all religionists are fundamentalists, and not all modernists, not all people who sort of have a rational, scientific view of the world are materialists, right? I would say that materialism, the extreme view that the only thing in the universe is matter in motion and that the universe is essentially an accident, that's a form of fundamentalism at the level of a modernity, right? And even at the progressive level, you have people who are wonderfully inclusive and pluralistically open, and you have forms of fundamentalism within the progressive postmodern culture. So understanding that these forms of fundamentalism are like eddies in the river, these sort of backward flows that end up in little whirlpools. That's a way of understanding the blindness that insists that the universe is just matter in motion. And so just like we wouldn't spend a lot of time considering the ideas of fundamentalist Christians, at least, we might love them and appreciate there's truth in there, but you don't want to argue with one. The same goes with the scientific materialists, right? That's a form of fundamentalist view, which I think is holding science back at this point. Not that we want to eliminate what you might call methodological naturalism, right? An approach of science is that we want to explain things with as much natural causes as possible. But when we look around, and the most fundamental thing there is, consciousness can't be described in materialistic terms, and it's not reducible to matter. Should be ample evidence to refute materialism. Gwilda, it's very important for people to be able to distinguish between science and scientism, right? Science is one of humanity's greatest achievements, right? I mean, all you have to do is look at the wonders of scientific medicine to appreciate how the human condition has been dramatically improved by science over the last 300 years. But scientism is a philosophy of science, or almost like a religion of science, which includes extra scientific assumptions about the universe being purely material. And that's an outworn belief system that is not doing science any good.
We're going to have to take another short break here. We'll pick up with this on the other side. Steve and I will be back shortly, so don't leave us now. This is The Science of Magic, thescienceofmagic.net, the place where altruistic professionals of science and the esoteric create common ground for the betterment of our world.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
I am Dr. Carl O'Helvey, founder, president of a new cancer foundation focusing on evidence-based physical, mental, and spiritual interventions, including natural cancer cures, prayer, meditation, affirmations, nutrition, and other related holistic cancer prevention and cure modalities. These are used in cancer education, research, and financing care. I ask for your help to continue this important work by donating at www.holisticcancerfoundation.com.
Wouldn't you love to know the secret to everything? I'm Dr. Kimberly McGeorge, and on The Secret to Everything, we will merge the practical with open investigation into all realms of the mysterious. We will talk to cutting-edge alternative health practitioners, those who inspire and motivate you in business and life, and of course, we will share stories of the paranormal, conspiracy, and cryptozoology. You will transform because of the frequency I carry, the frequencies my guests carry. Life may never be the same after you listen to this program, for the secret to everything is for you, the listener, for those who desire more in every area of their lives and believe that it can still be found. Listen and discover thesecrettoeverything.com.
Little children aren't the only ones afraid of the dark. Millions of soldiers return from war zones with PTSD, anger, frustration, fear, and loneliness, much of which surfaces during the darkness of the night. You have the chance to change the lives of these American heroes. Songs and Stories for Soldiers.us provides free MP3 players for these men and women. With a list of 3 million songs in 16 different styles, 100,000 audiobooks, and 30,000 old-time radio programs, every veteran can find something to soothe and comfort them at no cost. All our players contain an 8-hour audio program designed to help veterans fall asleep. With 1,500 plus vets now participating, it's our goal to deliver 10,000 audio players this year. Go to our website at songsandstoriesforsoldiers.us. Help us help a veteran make it through the night.
You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, bringing together gifted people of service to the world. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Steve McIntosh, the author of The Presence of the Infinite, Evolution's Purpose, and Integral Consciousness. His website is stevemcintosh.com. Steve, what do you think the cultural roots of America's current challenges are?
Well, as I spoke earlier about the different worldviews that occupy American culture, the mainstream of American culture, we could describe that worldview as modernity, right? You look at the pages of the New York Times, it expresses the values of rationalism, science, achievement, economic prosperity. Those mainstream values are the sort of identifying worldview for approximately 50% of the U.S. population. But it's also important to recognize, and I think it's pretty obvious, that about 30% of the U.S. population make meaning from a different worldview. This we generally describe as the traditional worldview. It's mostly Christianity, but not all, right? Not all. Many Christians are described to a modernist worldview. But for people who make meaning from a traditional worldview, for example, Scripture is more authoritative than science, right? If science contradicts Scripture, then Scripture has to be right. And these two worldviews have been interacting in various ways, both dialectically and cooperatively, since the Enlightenment for 350 years. But since the 1960s, a new worldview has emerged, which we sometimes refer to as progressive postmodernism. It's also been known as the cultural creative worldview. This is a distinct worldview that pushes off against both the materialism of modernity and the parochialism of the traditional worldview. In many ways, it's relying on the achievements of these previous worldviews, both materially and from a values perspective. But this countercultural worldview is seeking a more world-centric, a more holistic culture where people aren't as concerned with material possessions or achievement. They're more concerned with their own self-actualization and growth. And this countercultural worldview has disrupted American culture for both good and bad over the last 60 years. Right, it began in the 60s as a kind of a youth movement. We could trace its roots before that, but it sort of gained momentum and became a distinct worldview in the 70s and 80s as the 60s movement was sort of assimilated into parts of the larger culture. You can see it in academia and in the entertainment industry and alternative spirituality, of course, the environmental movement. There's many ways in which this cultural frame is in antithesis to the rest of the culture. So appreciating that politics is downstream from culture, it helps us envision a way of influencing people's values, indeed evolving their consciousness, not to make them necessarily all progressive or countercultural, but a way in which that people don't have to change their values. They can expand the scope of what they're able to value. They can come to appreciate the upside of every one of these worldviews, regardless of which one they choose as their primary, meaning-making frame. So getting a clear view of the dynamics of cultural development and seeing how values create people's identity, engender their loyalty. It suggests an approach to building agreement and political will and overcoming the stuckness of the polarization that is currently paralyzing politics in America and elsewhere.
Mm. Our guest this hour is Steve McIntosh, a leader in the integral philosophy movement and author of the book, The Presence of the Infinite. His website is stevemcintosh.com. So, Steve, now that the hippies have thrown a wrench in the works,
you can say that.
What can the average person do to start moving towards this agreement, a place of agreement where we can value each other's viewpoints even if we don't take them on?
Sure. Well, one of the opportunities for, as I said, making the move toward increasing the scope of what you're able to value is appreciating these worldview structures, how they make meaning within us. Right? Our consciousness isn't completely controlled by cultural worldviews, but cultural worldviews supply an important part of our identity, and in some ways they think our thoughts for us. They provide our opinions by reference to the cultural group that we identify with, and so this is natural and positive, but it's important that people appreciate that a worldview can have you or you can have it, and the process of evolving your consciousness involves turning what was once subject into object, right? So that you can still hold your same views, you can still appreciate the same worldview, but you can appreciate other people's worldviews in a way that you can't if you can't stand outside your own worldview, if you can't look at it from the outside, right? If you can't take a broader perspective on it. And that's not a thesis of relativism, but it does help people appreciate that their worldview is a system. And in today's culture, those systems are in relation to each other. And the more we can harmonize the relationships between, different worldviews, the more we can increase our value metabolism, if you will, to be able to recognize the positive values that we, in a sense, already share with the worldviews that we might normally oppose. This is one of the ways we can achieve greater cultural unity. It involves appreciating the structures of consciousness and culture from the outside as well as participating in them from the inside.
So basically, we're being challenged with turning everything inside and out. Historically, we've been controlled by our worldview, and we're looking at the opportunity to use our worldview as a way to interface with the world but not be controlled by it.
Sure, and we can also appreciate that every one of these worldviews has both important ideals and ideas as well as pathologies, right? Every one is burdened by a shadow. And so being able to tell the difference between, so for example, if we're progressives and we look at traditional worldview and we see only bigotry and xenophobia and authoritarianism, all the negatives that go with a traditional worldview, when you don't appreciate how our society is living on the borrowed capital of the achievements of these traditional worldviews, right? The fair play, honesty, decency, respect for rightful authority. These are values that are part of the internal cultural ecosystem upon which we rely. So being able to recognize that every one of the values stages, every one of these levels or worldviews has both positive values that we need to carry forward or we're going to regress ourselves, as well as pathologies that we need to prune away and diminish. That important work of teasing apart the dignities from the disasters is a very important practice that goes with expanding the scope of what we're able to value and evolving our consciousness in the process.
Steve, what changes do you see coming for humanity in the next 10 years?
Well, with the election of Trump, things are highly unpredictable, right? We're certainly at a crossroads. Regression is a greater possibility than it's ever been. But sometimes if you're going to jump, you have to stoop down. There's ways in which a certain amount of readjustment backward, if you will, is a prerequisite to a more stable advance forward. So what I see in the next 10 years is I'm optimistic. I see ultimately that there will be a maturity, a cultural maturity in the society, not across the board, not as if all our problems or shortcomings are going to be overcome in 10 years. But I do think that that all things eventually work together for good, and that even something as threatening as the Trump administration in 10 years will lead to a larger development that can come from the ways in which the negatives that are associated with this period of Trump will make us appreciate things we may have taken for granted before. So again, I don't want to be completely Pollyanna about it. We have to fight against regression, but at the same time, I think that we have a moral duty to be optimistic.
So we have a couple minutes left. What can you tell us about the Institute for Cultural Evolution?
Well, this integral perspective, this emerging new worldview that's postmodern, right? If you'll pardon the term, we're transcending and including the achievements and the pathologies of the progressive counterculture. We're kind of coming out of that, but we're trying to re-include modernity and even traditionalism and pre-traditional. We're making our advance beyond the antithesis of this progressive culture through the process described by Hegel, the negation of the negation. Right? We're partially negating the anti-modernism and the reverse patriotism that we see in progressive culture, and that doesn't mean that we're going to return to being, xenophobic or sort of traditionally patriotic, but it also means that we can appreciate how modernity is foundational and it's one of the greatest achievements of humanity. And while we want to do better than that, we want to get rid of the pathologies. We don't want to have environmental degradation or oppression or gross inequality. But we also don't want to go back to living on $2 a day. So this way in which we're coming to be more sympathetic to these earlier stages that the progressive culture rejects is one of the ways that this perspective yields a new kind of politics, a more inclusive kind of politics. And that's what the Institute for Cultural Institute represents, is a platform for the ideas and the activities that go with wanting to evolve beyond our current culture of hyper-partisan polarity.
So people can find more about that on your website?
Well, sure. I have two websites. My author website that goes more with my spiritual work and philosophy is stevemcintosh.com. But the Institute for Cultural Evolution, I'm the president, but it's not just mine. There are other people involved, and that is culturalevolution.org. And there are activities there. You can take a worldview test or a polarization test, lots of papers to read and videos. It's a
time flies.
Explanation.
Time flies and we're out of it. Thank you so much for being with us. Our guest this hour has been Steve McIntosh, a leader in the integral philosophy movement and author of the book Presence of the Infinite. His website is stevemcintosh.com. Until next time, dear ones, may you be blessed with knowledge and comforted with love as you embrace a third option. Don't miss our next program, thescienceofmagic.net.
One people, one nation, searching through the night. One people, one nation, searching for the light. One people, one nation,